years, I've had the opportunity to work with some of our area's most vulnerable children and families. One particular group that I've worked with directly are those without a home or homeless. For many of these families, their daily lives are riddled with various obstacles, and their existence is dependent on their survival skills. Today, we will begin to peel back some of these layers on homelessness. We hope that this conversation is informative, thought-provoking, and challenges you. While conversations like this can be difficult, we hope to keep you engaged. Feel free to share using the chat function, sharing your thoughts, questions, or even your aha moments. With that said, I'd like to once again welcome you to welcome our panelists, Sasha, Maria, and Lee. Let's jump right into our panel conversation. So the first question I'm going to ask of all three panelists is, if you could only share two very important things that you think our audience needs to know about women and children facing homelessness or housing insecurities, what would that be? Let's begin with you, Sasha.
Thank you, Natasha. So one of the most important things I think everyone should know, and I've learned through my experience working with this population, is that they are some of the smartest, kindest, most resilient people I've ever met. And I think it's a common misconception that, homeless folks that experience homelessness are oftentimes stigmatized and maybe think lesser of them. But really, they're brilliant people navigating a system where they're not necessarily meant to succeed, which brings me to my next point. Oftentimes, homelessness is perpetuated by this system of not being able to get ahead through limits to their access to services. So once they're a penny over the income limit for services such as food stamps or rental assistance or even childcare subsidies for families, their access is completely cut off. So this really goes into understanding why it's so hard to get ahead when someone is experiencing homelessness, and it might not be the priority to take that job promotion, because that job promotion is going to cut off your access to food stamps, and you're not going to be able to feed your family. Are the two most important things I would love everyone to know about this population. And I'll give it over to Maria.
Thanks, Sasha, and thanks so much for including me in today's conversation. I firmly believe that we can't talk about women experiencing homelessness without also talking about domestic violence, because the two are inextricably linked, and linked in some ways that I think that could be surprising. So if I were to send you away today with only remembering two things, it would be that, first of all, homelessness and domestic violence are incredibly prevalent, and domestic violence within homeless communities is incredibly prevalent. And the second is that DV shelter is often viewed as the response, and it doesn't have to be the only one. So 92% of homeless women and children have reported experiencing domestic violence at some point in their lives. 50% of all homeless women report that DV was the immediate cause of their episode of homelessness. And among mothers with children experiencing homelessness, more than 80% previously experienced domestic violence. So, as I said, you can't talk about one without talking about the other. And I think that when we see a survivor of domestic violence, we may have one reaction. And when we see a homeless woman on the street, we might have another. And both of those are often the same people, just experiencing different circumstances. And what we know is that if domestic violence interventions don't happen quickly and effectively and in the way that the survivor wants them to happen, homelessness can often be the end result. Once a family becomes homeless too, they're far more likely to become homeless again. And that leads me to the second myth, which is that I know that many of you are familiar with the idea of domestic violence confidential emergency shelter. I think that folks in the social service and legal fields, that's sort of the thing that is commonly known. And it's not the only response. Once a survivor into emergency shelter, they become homeless. And so it's much harder for them to regain their footing in the community, to get back into their lives and work and faith communities if they have entered shelter and become homeless. We also know that shelter is the exact response that some survivors need, but it's not the only one. And I'm excited to talk to you today about some other responses that we can use to support survivors of domestic violence who are experiencing homelessness. And with that, I'll pass it to Lee.
Thanks, and good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us for this important conversation. I think the first thing that I would like for folks to know is just how common homelessness is among this population. If folks are hoping to walk away with a specific number, I can't necessarily provide you with that. But what I can tell you is that the federal government, through the Housing and Urban Development HUD, requires communities to do an enumeration of folks experiencing homelessness in their community every year. It's called the point in time count. You may have heard of it. It usually happens every January. And according to the point in time count, on just one day in January, there's over 1,500 families with children experiencing homelessness in the state of Pennsylvania. That is not meant to be a comprehensive number or a year-round number, an annualized number. It's also not, that number intentionally does not include families who are doubled up and sleeping on somebody's couch or sleeping at grandma's house or whatever. It also doesn't count folks who weren't able to be identified or found on that particular day and time that a count was occurring. And so that 1,500 number really represents not just, if you're thinking, okay, that's probably in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh and Allentown. And you're right, it certainly includes those three cities, but it also includes the suburbs, it includes rural communities, it includes homelessness really everywhere throughout the state. I work statewide and can tell you that rural communities are struggling to address homelessness among families as much as urban communities are as well. And so just to understand, like I said, that number really represents only families who are in emergency shelters, transitional housing programs, and who are identified sleeping somewhere that's considered by HUD to be unsheltered, which would be in cars or in an abandoned building or locations like that. The second thing I just want to share right out of the gate is just what is sometimes not really understood by folks when it comes to housing, which is that housing is not an entitlement program. Entitlement programs include, for example, SNAP or food stamps. It includes Medicaid or medical assistance, as it's known here in Pennsylvania. It includes Social Security to the degree that somebody is, for example, a survivor's benefits or is injured and no longer able to work before they are of Social Security age. It includes unemployment insurance, for example, but it does not include housing. And so when we talk about homelessness, it's important to recognize that there is not a federal response or a state response that is sufficiently funded to provide housing assistance to everybody in our country who has a need. So, for example, we have a significant number of folks across the country are homeless, but we have far more who are paying 30, 50, 75+% of their income each month to support their rent. And so when we talk about that, when we talk about solutions, it's important to recognize that the solutions really have to be identified. The funding to support solutions is not a guarantee, and it's a struggle.
Wow, thanks. So as you can see, there's a lot of conflicting information, attitudes, and stigmas regarding homelessness that absolutely need to be cleared up. So with that said, I'm actually going to ask Lee and Maria for you guys to kind of elaborate on this or answer this for me. What myths or stigmas do you often see or hear that need to be corrected as we educate the public about women and children that are homeless? So Maria, you want to start first?
Sure, thanks, Natasha. I think the main thing that is sort of a myth about domestic violence in general also holds over to survivors that are experiencing homelessness, which is that it's the survivor's fault. And that's a tricky place to navigate, because I think that most of us would hear the story of someone who's experiencing domestic violence and think how terrible this is that this happened to them, and that they deserve help and support and this sort of thing. But when it comes right down to it, oftentimes because of the things that we hear from survivors, we don't trust that they're actually able to do the things that they need to do to keep themselves safe and healthy and happy, and keep their kids safe and healthy and happy, to the extent that oftentimes youth and family services and other punitive measures can be taken on survivors who are attempting to parent while living in a violent home. And I think that when we are faced with either staying with a roof over our head in a violent relationship, or taking our kids and leaving and not knowing where we're going, and not knowing if we're going to have to sleep on the street, and not knowing how we're going to feed our kids, that choice is almost impossible to make. And that's just the first choice that a survivor has to make. That doesn't go on to like, well, if I do leave, where am I going to live? And what am I going to tell my family? And how am I going to stay away from my partner? And do I even want to stay away from my partner? And all of these other conflicts. So it's not just a crisis in housing, it's a crisis in someone's spirit. And I think that we don't often see that whole picture. It can be very easy to say, well, if you had just done this or this or this, then maybe things would be different. Or will it resolve itself? Maybe it's not that bad. Maybe you can make things work. And truly, that it's the survivor's choice, and that's what needs to be centered. And that's what we center in Pennsylvania, and all the work that we do with survivors is, what does a survivor actually want? Knowing that they're the experts in their own lives, and they're the ones who are going to have to live with whatever choices they make. And even if they're not the choices that I might make, I'm not living that person's life. And so it's really important when we're supporting survivors to let them really guide the way. And that includes survivors that are experiencing homelessness, because the crisis is so significant. It's really our responsibility to walk alongside survivors and ask what they need. Oftentimes, it's rare that any of us get asked what we need, I think, but in particular, folks that are really experiencing crisis, we just jump in and believe that we know. And the fact is that we don't. Our role is to be able to provide resources and support alongside whatever the survivor is saying that they want or need. The second thing that I think is a myth is something I sort of spoke to prior, is that DV shelter is the only response. One thing sort of universally that domestic violence brings up for people is a pretty significant sense of fear. And that makes sense. And I have worked with many, many survivors over my career who have been in such scary situations that the moment I thought that I had heard the worst, I heard something else. And it's harrowing, and it is the need that I think that folks have who are safe to help other people get safe and make other people safe and bring them to safety, I think is really compelling and significant. But again, because once a family is homeless, it's far more likely they're going to become homeless again. If we can help survivors avoid emergency shelter altogether, the likelihood that they're going to be safe and stable more quickly is far greater. So as much as it's important to support the work of domestic violence shelters and make sure that the shelter in your community is safe and intact, it's also really important to work with the social service programs and domestic violence service organizations in your community to make sure that they are getting support outside of just their shelter, because shelter is always that immediate response, and safety looks different for every survivor. Safety for some survivors may even be that they feel most safe sleeping in their car. And so while that is terrifying to me, it would be my job to make sure that the survivor has whatever it is they need to feel safe to stay in that car, because that's what they've determined is best for them. So really looking at what options are for survivors and being able to provide the things that are most in alignment with what they're identifying is really important. And that can often be outside of just the general sort of emergency confidential shelter that we're oriented really the entire DV movement to offering. And so this is a big shift in perspective and a way to move through to make folks more safe more quickly.
I really appreciate you sharing that, because I think those of us that are not involved in social services, human services, or have experience working with DV survivors, they really don't understand the link or the connection between being a survivor and being homeless. And I really, really appreciate you pulling that back a little bit and having more conversation. I think it's important for the community to know that these women and families are in survival mode and they have to make some really hard choices. Lee, what are your thoughts on some myths or stigmas regarding homelessness?
Yeah, so I think one of the myths or stigmas that I hear often, and it's hard to swallow, I think, is this idea that homelessness is really caused by sort of the failure of an individual or a household. If they had made different choices, they would be in a different situation, as opposed to the failure of our government or our society to ensure that folks, regardless of decisions made, have access to affordable and stable housing. I think it's really easy to go down this rabbit hole to, examine somebody's life under a microscope and think if they had made different choices, then they would be in a different situation. And I think that's, honest to goodness, true for all of us. I think what it often happens is that it's easy for us to sort of explain somebody's situation based on what we know and understand about their situation. And then sort of beyond that, even as social service providers, make determinations about, what it is that they need that's going to make a difference. When we actually know that housing is what ends homelessness, and what they need is housing. But yet we may sit here and say, they need budgeting skills. Well, I don't know about you, but if you have ever seen a mother with several children and a limited amount of food stamps feed her children all month, I can assure you that they need far less budgeting assistance than me, who I can assure you in 25 years have not balanced my own checkbook. Probably I was in college the last time I balanced my checkbook. And for those of you who know me, that was a long time ago. So if somebody's going to benefit in this situation from budgeting, I can assure you it's far more likely to be me than somebody who is balancing and sort of utilizing the resources very, very carefully. Another example of that is life skills. That's not to say that these are not valuable services. Some folks who are experiencing homelessness very much need these resources and would identify that for themselves. The difference is when we say, oh, well, if you were a better budgeter, or if you had more life skills, you wouldn't be in this situation. When in fact, if we had guaranteed right to housing, that person would not be in this situation. I think that there is going to continue to be indefinitely for people who are housing insecure and people who are experiencing homelessness, as long as we have low paying jobs. They're linked. We know for a fact that this got worse during COVID and during the pandemic, that more folks lost their employment and they were already living on the edge. At the same time, rents have gone up in some communities 20% or more. And so these things can't coexist without folks being significantly underhoused or homeless. And so the you know, to really make progress towards solving this, it's not the fault of each individual household. Our society relies on having folks to do different types of jobs, which we then value in different types of monetary ways. And at the same time, as communities, our rents continue to rise. And so this is not an individual flaw of a person as to why they become homelessness, but really a failure of our own society to protect and to provide.
I really appreciate that, because what you're really saying is that these stigmas are just reinforcing ideas and stereotypes opposed to really looking at the systems that are involved. And I think if we took a chance to look at the systems involved, we would better be able to support the individuals. So thank you for sharing that. So we're going to move on. In your experience, please discuss the process of finding permanent shelter for those who find themselves without a home, particularly women and children. And I think this question is more appropriate for Maria and Sasha.
Thank you, Natasha. So my role is basically to do just that. I'm a housing case manager. So what I do every day is work with folks who are homeless to find permanent housing and in housing. And it's just incredibly hard, and it almost feels nearly impossible sometimes, because the first three things that any landlord asks on an application are landlord references, criminal history, and credit check. And if you're homeless and you have been for years or even decades, of course you don't have landlord references, and you don't have the means or a way to build credit. And maybe you have a criminal charge that took place decades ago, but it's still in your record. And if you don't meet all three of those requirements, your application is immediately disqualified. The housing market, especially where I am, is outrageous. We have like a less than 1% an occupancy rate. So from the start, there is really no housing. The pool of opportunities is so small when landlords are requesting that people have all these, a perfect record, a perfect history, perfect landlord references, and then on top of that, generally there's an application fee, which my clients, they can't afford to do. So we're just continually reducing the size of the pool of opportunities of housing that even exists, and on top of landlords not giving people the chance. And then for families, I've had the experience with clients where they're very where they can look for housing is very area specific, because their children are in school and they don't want to pull their kids out of school. So they want to provide the opportunity for their kids to not uproot them, and maintain that sense of security with the children. And maybe it's just more convenient for them to continue living in a hotel or continue living with a car or an unstable household, simply because they don't want to give their children like a transient lifestyle that maybe they experience. I know Leah and Maria both acknowledged that many folks who are currently homeless maybe grew up homeless, and it's just a systemic issue. And finding housing is an almost impossible sometimes. And for context, sometimes I have looked for, I think, over like 14 months in some cases to help people find a place to live. So it is not easy by any means. Maria, if you want to add to this.
Sure. Thanks, Sasha. I think that your experience is so great to hear about because you're doing this right now with people. And I found, and through my career, having done very similar work to you, that there are a few people that understand what it's really like to sort of walk alongside someone as they're attempting to find housing. And it's crazy because it's wild to think about because it's overwhelming oftentimes, I think, for case managers or for folks that work in the DV system to go through that process, much less how that must feel for the person that's actually trying to find housing. So I really appreciate what you're saying. I wanted to highlight a little bit about sort of what it takes for a survivor to find permanent shelter. I've spoken quite a bit about shelter already, and in the housing homeless world, we have our very own vocabulary that we like to make exclusive and keep from people, which makes literally no sense and is often more in alignment with like policy and bills than it is real life experience. So keep that in mind as we're talking, but we'll promise to not make it too wonky. But I do want to let you know a little bit about what it sort of takes to walk somebody through. First of all, a survivor will often call a DV hotline, and most programs in the state of Pennsylvania have a dedicated hotline where if there is a need that a survivor has, they can reach out and call. The National Network to End Domestic Violence does a year count. Lee previously mentioned the point in time count. We do our own for DV. And it's around service requests. And in 2021, 75% of the unmet service requests across the state of Pennsylvania were for emergency, temporary, or permanent housing. So the majority of need in the state is around housing, stability, housing needs, and oftentimes an immediate response to that. We work really hard to make sure that programs across the state have the capacity and ability to respond as needed, but it's not always possible. With that, there's a finite amount of space in emergency shelter. So if a survivor calls and they say, I need to get out and I need to get out now, and the survivor comes into emergency shelter, and as I said, that effectively makes them homeless at that point, they then can stay in emergency shelter for as long as they need to until they've secured permanent housing. Now, that's an ideal situation because the need, obviously, from the statistics that I shared with you, is far greater than what the capacity is. So when you have a need that's far greater than capacity, it's our instinct to either move people on more quickly than they probably should be moved on, or to limit what a shelter stay can look like. And so although our federal funding actually denotes that we can't limit shelter stays, there are many programs that do because the capacity is overwhelmed and doesn't meet the need. So there are times that a survivor can leave the domestic violence emergency shelter without anywhere to go, therefore making them oftentimes homeless on the street. That, of course, is not what we want, but it does happen. This often happens too with survivors that need the housing resources the most. So survivors that are dealing with substance use, survivors that are dealing with physical health or mental health concerns. As we were saying before, it has taken up to 14 months sometimes for a family to find housing. When you are living in an emergency situation and you know that your housing is not permanent, and you are also trying to manage your kids, and you are also dealing with substance use, and you're also dealing with generally untreated mental health issues, because oftentimes survivors aren't allowed to access the sort of physical health and mental health care that they need. That's a tool that abusive partners often use. Abusive partners often also make sure that survivors don't get access to recovery services if that's what they need. It all is very systemic to really keep survivors oppressed, then those survivors are much harder to find housing for, and they often end up homeless on the street. If we can find housing for them, then oftentimes that process takes up to a year to locate an appropriate unit. There are all kinds of temporary housing measures that can be used in between, but those are all dependent on government funding and how government funding is being used at the time. The most significant investment, though, over the last few years in housing that's dedicated to domestic violence survivors is through the Department of Housing and Urban Development. They've done a set aside each year for the last 3 years to support long-term permanent housing for survivors. And the great thing about this is it's living in the community like Sasha helps folks do, but with rental assistance and supportive services, which we know is the key to helping survivors maintain their housing. It's great when somebody has a house and can move in, but if a survivor doesn't have the support that they need, that they're identifying they need, it's very easy to return to an abusive partner or to find yourself in an unsafe living situation again. And so it's these long-term permanent housing measures that we're hoping to bridge the gap between the emergency shelter experience and that long-term housing in far shorter ways as the infrastructure for the system moves forward in Pennsylvania. So it is a long, complex process, and it is, I think, to Sasha's point, that there are times when, homelessness can be generational, and if a survivor saw their parents being unhoused when they were small, it is far less likely that they're going to want to be unhoused themselves. And so they may stay in abusive situations because they know how hard it is to navigate that system that I just took you through. And that's honestly, I took you through the easy version. We make it much harder for people to find housing. And it's things that the government puts in place. So really looking for alternatives that truly meet the needs of homeless folks in your community is essential, and will be one of the things that solves homelessness in your community. And not having those alternatives in place, I think, is oftentimes the thing that keeps people unsafe, keeps survivors in situations they don't want to be in.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to take a moment real quickly to see if anyone would like to ask our panelists any questions before we move on to the last question. I saw Barbara, you had your hand up. Is that an accident, or do you have a question for us? Unmute, Barbara. Okay, maybe an accident. That's fine. Okay. Okay. Anyone have a question that they'd like to throw in the chat or would like to unmute?
I have a question, Natasha. This is Romina.
Yes. Hi, Romina.
Hi. So I'm just curious to find out, what kind of legislation allows for these loopholes, and is there anything that is being done to correct loopholes that are present in the system that keep the people, homeless? Thank you. And whoever wants to answer that.
Sure, I'll start, but I'm going to hope that others chime in. I will just say that it's really complex. And there's not an easy answer. I will tell you that there are advocates all across the country who do the work that I do, that do the work that Maria does, that do the work that Sasha does, that are working really at different levels of government, of community-based organizations, and with individuals to best navigate the resources that exist. The reality, though, is, this is to resolve homelessness is going to take, folks at every level. It's not just the allocation of resources by the government, it's then going to require landlords, for example, to accept those resources. It's going to require employers to hire folks who may have, you know, a very, you know, any type of various types of backgrounds, whether that's a criminal record, whether that's, you know, some jobs do a credit history. I don't, you know, perhaps if you are, depending on the field, maybe that makes sense, but I certainly don't think that to be a, you know, a cashier at Target, and I don't know if Target specifically does, I shouldn't have named somebody because I wasn't trying to imply that, but nonetheless, you know, there are certain positions that would make sense, but others, they do not. And so the truth is that until we have, you know, commitments to addressing disparities in the education system, until we have some, you know, folks addressing disparities in behavioral health care and physical health care, and until we have really an entire community of folks who are working sort of hand in glove and in concert with each other to really create stronger safety nets, there's not really enough money to throw at the problem. It's going to require lots of coordination and lots of partnerships. Certainly, I think every level can do more. You know, the feds can allocate more money and loosen up restrictions. Community-based organizations can, you know, make adjustments on their end to efficiently use resources. And again, that is not to suggest that they're not already doing that. But my point is to say that the answers are wide and varied.
Thank you, Lee. We have time for another question. Please feel free to unmute. Okay. And you can also, if you don't feel comfortable unmuting, you can put a question in the chat box. All right, so we will continue on. So now this is a question for all three of our panelists. As we are wrapping up this conversation, what is the call to action? What would actually be helpful that our audience could do to begin to make a difference in both the lives of women and children that are either supportive or create solutions? What are some of the people or agencies or organizations that you're working with that serve women and children facing housing insecurities? So what can we do? The average person that's at home that really just wants to do something beneficial. I remember when we talked, we said, you know, like, don't sell, it's not the toiletries. It's bigger than sending your toiletries. What can they do? And I'll start with Sasha. What would make a difference?
To Lee's point, going back to the question and also in relationship to this question, all the money in the world and the housing programs designed by HUD, those mean nothing if there is no landlords willing to rent to people experiencing homelessness. So that's sort of my call to action, is it for any landlords out there, or you know, people who know people with other, you know, like two homes, and one's a summer home, like consider renting that unit to someone that doesn't have a perfect landlord reference, or you know, someone that is homeless and doesn't meet the credit criteria that you might have formerly wanted. But that's sort of my call to action, is that it takes people externally outside of the social service agencies, like what I'm working for and what I'm working towards with my clients. I really can't get anything done if there's just no housing opportunity for that client at all. So, you know, talk to your friends and your family and consider accepting vouchers it's a more stable source of income, honestly, than, but that's sort of what I would have to say, and just have an open heart towards this population.
I appreciate that. Maria, what are your thoughts?
Well, my first would be to believe survivors, that if you are, if you have a friend that's going through something, or a family member, or you know of someone through your faith community or what have you, if a survivor is telling you that they don't want to go to emergency shelter, that they don't want to have to become homeless to get safe, believe them. And if we just believed women on the whole, I mean, I think the whole world would change. But and truly, I think that there's more of a systemic call to action here, that like you can't talk about one social justice issue without having an intersectional view of how all of these issues come together. And so the more we can work in collaboration with anti-poverty efforts in our communities, anti-racism efforts in our communities, the more we can support fair and equal pay, the more that we can do all of these things, the less we're going to see survivors become homeless, women in general become homeless. So the more we work for equity, the more equity we're going to see across the board. I work for the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Our website is pcadv.org. And if you go there, you can enter your zip code and it will show you who your local program is. So if you live in the Philadelphia area, it'll show you the ones in Philadelphia. If you live in Bucks County, it'll show you the program in Bucks County, et cetera. And what I would encourage you to do is reach out to your local domestic violence program and ask them what it is they really need. To Natasha's point, and all of us that have worked in social services could tell you stories about toiletries. You wouldn't believe them, but it's true. And so moving beyond the idea that like your local program would want the shampoo bottles that you take from a hotel, what is it that they actually need? And it may not be the thing that you think. It may not be that like, oh, well, I am certain that these folks need food, so I'm going to take a bag of food to the shelter. They may have more food than they know what to do with because it's something that folks think to donate. But what they may be really struggling with is the fact that they need a new air conditioner and they can't find anybody to do the repair work, nor can they get anybody to fund it because nobody wants to fund capital costs. And if they do, it's a whole thing and a whole procedure. And they actually needed the air conditioner last year, but they put it off. Like, if you have real conversations with the folks that are running social service organizations in your community, I think that you'll come to these things that like, oh, actually, I have a friend who works on air conditioners and I'm going to send them to help you and they'll do it for free. And these sort of things, like building community connections that way. And then the third thing I would encourage you to do is to donate. There is nothing that is going to be more impactful to women and children getting the things that they need than more money being infused in the system that is to directly meet their need rather than flowing through HUD and all these other organizations and government bodies, but really coming from the local personal donors that want to change the lives of women and children in their communities. So donate, 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 and make sure that those donations are in alignment with what is actually needed in the community. It can have a huge impact.
Thank you. And Lee.
Yeah, I think, my comments really just piggyback off of what Sasha and Maria just said. I think, honestly, if this is something that you're interested in, you're committed to, I think a lot of us have, a cause or multiple causes that we, hold near and dear to our heart. And if this is certainly one of those for you, I would say everybody has a role to play. I think whether you're a landlord, as Sasha said, just by example, through COVID-related money the system right now is flooded with money, specifically for rental assistance, and the money is being returned to the federal government because we cannot find rental units to lease. Landlords are making decisions to not renew leases for folks, or regardless of incentives provided, guarantees provided, et cetera, are still refusing to rent to folks who have histories of homelessness and domestic violence. So if you have even one unit, if you are an employer, if you are, whatever your job is, if you cut hair or are a dentist, or regardless of anything, there is a way for you to get involved and to really make a difference on this issue. If you're not any of those things and you think, what can I do? Money is always good, as Maria just said. There's a lot of organizations, regardless of whether you're in Philadelphia or somewhere else, that I'm sure that can use your contributions. And I know that the ZenaEmpowered group is going to circulate a list of organizations as well. In addition to that, I sign up for one of the links that I provided was for the National Alliance to End Homelessness, and they do advocacy alerts through their mailing list if you join. And certainly, I think it's impactful for folks to hear from people like Sasha, Maria, and myself when the federal budget is being debated. But it's also really impactful for them to hear from you. We do this day in and day out, and we can throw all kinds of numbers and figures and all of these sorts of things at them, but they expect that from us. That's our job. But when they hear this from community members who are passionate and caring about these causes and issues, it really does make a huge difference. Even though the system is flooded with money right now, it's not going to hurt from having additional money. I can assure you of that. And the bottom line is, if we don't continue to increase the amount of funds that are being allocated to address homelessness every year, then the existing programs actually shrink, because fair market rents increase every year. So if there's not at least an increase above the base funding from one year to the next, that results in a reduction in inventory for homeless assistance. And so, steady increases are great. Major increases are great. But I would say, like I said, regardless of really who you are, what your strengths are, what your resources are, what your occupation is, I would encourage you to get involved in your community organizations who are working on these issues.
Thank you. We have one last question, and I'm actually glad that this came out from the Rosen family. And we have 3 minutes to answer this question. Actually, 2 minutes to answer this question, because we want to keep it to 60 minutes. And the question is, what keeps you hopeful and motivated to keep going in such a challenging field? So, Lee, we'll start with you because you're already pinned. Sorry. So just
that's fine. I'm just long-winded, so I'll talk really fast.
You have 30 seconds.
Okay. Last weekend, I drove to Western Pennsylvania for my first in-person meeting since COVID. COVID began, and I met with folks who were involved in a youth action board in Western Pennsylvania. And these are youth that were involved in various systems, children and youth, juvenile probation, homelessness, etc., before they were 18 years old. And they were meeting for the weekend for a retreat to identify strategies to prevent and end homelessness among youth in their communities. They had experienced things that are beyond, thank goodness, anything I have ever even imagined as a kid. And yet they were collectively coming together to say, enough is enough. What can we do to identify supports, to strengthen our community's response, et cetera, and to really see people who have experienced homelessness come to really use their voice in such a powerful way is something that I think really keeps me going.
Awesome. Thank you. Maria, 30 seconds.
My whole career, my whole heart has been to improve the lives of women and children. And I think that knowing that we're working at this from a systemic issue is really impactful, from a systemic space is really impactful, and really works to change lives in a way that, like, we're all part of the process and we're all part of the solution. And I'm resoundingly grateful that I am able to do this work, because I really do believe that it can change the scope of what things look like for women and children. And Sasha gets to do that every day in a real way.
And I am saving Sasha for last because she is our rising professional. So Sasha, what keeps you motivated?
Well, when things really do work out, that is what keeps me motivated. And when there are those warm-hearted landlords that give my clients a second chance, that is just heartwarming, and that's what keeps me going. I had one client who I think I looked for 8 months with for an apartment. Finally, he found an apartment, and after everything, this apartment had the most beautiful view of the lake. I live in Burlington, Vermont. There's Lake Champlain, and he had $1 million view from this apartment, and he has a permanent housing voucher, so he'll get to live there he's in his 70s. He was living on the street, and now he's going to live out the rest of his life, hopefully in this like amazing apartment. And it just is a success story, and things like that is what keeps me going.
Thank you, Sasha, and keep up the good work. So I'd like to thank our panelists, Sasha, Maria, and Lee, on behalf of ZenaEmpowered for giving this presentation and conversation around homelessness. I'd also like to thank all of you who attended this session, and we hope that you walk away informed, educated, and inspired. And Lori, any last words?
I wrote it in my chat. Thank you, Natasha, too, and to all three of you who are just dedicating yourselves and your life work to helping people and shedding light on these issues that now we can all come away with. And please follow us on social media. We have recorded this if you want to hear it again or share it with your friends and colleagues. And any questions you have, I'm sure we can get answers. So thank you all. Thank you, Natasha, and to all of you.